part of the day. Dr. Len Pietrafesa earned his bachelor's degree in physics and mathematics from Fairfield University, his MS degree from Boston College in tandem with the University of Chicago in geophysical fluid dynamics, and his PhD in geophysical fluid dynamics and physics from the University of Washington in 1973. He has wide-ranging work in industry and academia. He is Professor Emeritus at North Carolina State University, where, among other responsibilities, he served as head of the Department of Marine, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences. And he is also Burroughs and Chapin Scholar at Coastal Carolina University. Dr. Pietrafesa's professional experience and service include several prominent positions in groups such as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the North Carolina Department of Natural and Environmental Resources, and the American Geophysical Union. Among his scholarly interests are the relationship between climate and weather, observations and modeling of atmospheric, oceanic, estuary, and land systems, wind-wave interaction, and sea level rise and variability. Please help me welcome Dr. Pietrafesa.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was a nice presentation, Spencer. I enjoyed learning more about inlets. We can go to the next slide, please. I was asked to talk about estuaries in general, saltwater marshes, and barrier island inlets. As those of you who have lived here your lives understand that these estuaries form and saltwater marshes form where the ocean waters meet fresh water, and these bodies tend to have enormous plant presence, as well as they brim with coastal life, all kinds of coastal life. They hold life-giving nutrients from the land and from the ocean, and we get many of our nutrients in the Southeast Atlantic Bight from the Gulf Stream, actually, which comes across the shelf, since we don't have that much fresh water draining into the systems. So, but we do have nutrients from land as well as from the and in fact, the ecosystems are so rich that they're richer in terms of the quantity of species that are there per square inch than the richest Midwest farms. They provide, these estuaries and marshlands provide essential habitat for over 75% of our nation's commercial and recreational fish catch, the wildland inhabitants, and more than 28 million jobs nationally. These fish alone generate $120 billion, the fish that occupy those marshlands, in 2017 dollars. So they're really national treasures. Sunset Beach is a bar-built barrier island estuary, obviously with a saltwater marsh, and contains primary nursery areas that are called PNAs. And one of the things about estuaries and saltwater marshes is that they are energy absorbing. That is that many of them exist in areas where we have significant atmospheric storm activity, and so these saltwater marshes actually protect the mainland to some degree. So next slide. This is a study that was done by Chris Taylor et al. He's a NOAA scientist in Beaufort, North Carolina. So he's a fisheries biologist, along with John Miller, who's now, he is now deceased, but John was a fisheries biologist at NC State, and then myself and Dave Dickey, who were, you know, I'm a fluid physicist, and Dave is a statistician, and Steve Ross, who is a NOAA fisheries biologist in Wilmington, where Spencer resides. And we studied 105 of the fish nurseries in North Carolina, and we finally focused on 77 that were actually had significant years of continuous data. So there were 77 primary nursery areas that had 70, there were 77 of them that had at least 23 years of continuous data, so we focused on those. And this is fish presence data. That is that there are samples taken very frequently, often on a monthly basis for 23 years in these primary nurseries. And in the lower left corner, you notice there are two dots right where North Carolina ends, and that's Ocean Isle Beach and Sunset Beach. So those were part of the study. They're primary nursery areas. And many of the fish that were sampled were actually estuarine-dependent finfish, which means that they're spawned in the coastal ocean, and then the larvae and the metamorphosed larvae, which become juveniles, actually are carried by currents and waves to the coast, and then they make it through the inlets, and then they're carried up into the primary nursery. And Jinks Creek is obviously the pathway for both Ocean Isle Beach. Well, Ocean Isle Beach also has Shallotte Inlet at the east end, but Tubbs Inlet provides entrance to Sunset Beach nursery areas and Sunset and Ocean Isle Beach at the west side of Ocean Isle Beach, the nursery areas as well. And Jinks Creek is that pathway. So next. And if anyone wants to know more about primary nurseries, I suggest you contact either Steve Ross or Chris Taylor. I can give you contact information for both. This is an image that was provided to me. I gather that Moffett and Nichols has actually done a survey of some of the oyster beds in Jinks Creek. So, I think Dr. Hilderman knows quite well about the numbers of oysters that were found, and of course oysters are very valuable. Next slide. So I already referred to this in the sense that I said Jinks Creek as the pathway to the areas to the side where the marshes are. From my perspective, but I'm just a bench physicist, so what do I know about fish? I love eating fish if they're properly prepared, but that's the extent of it. My colleagues had to do the fisheries biology, but it seemed to me that de facto Jinks Creek should be identified as a primary nursery area, since it is the pathway into the system. Next. So a barrier island, generally speaking, in terms of how they formed, the east coast of the United States has a very wide continental margin. And these barrier islands formed along the coastline of the continental margins about 20,000 to 18,000 years ago, after the last ice age. And our barrier island systems began to form as sea level rise slowed, following the real the melting of the glaciers. Our barrier island systems began to emerge about 7,000 to 3,000 years ago. And they generally consist of overwash fans, a shore face, a surf zone, a beach, sand dunes, tidal inlet, plus they're characterized by longshore drift, that is flow up and down, flow and ebb tide deltas, a tidal marsh, tidal creeks, and tidal flats. And next. So, in terms of tubs, in general, sediments come from longshore flow, offshore waves, rivers, and overwash fans. Now, tubs doesn't have a river feeding into it, so we eliminate number 3. But in general, that's where barrier islands get their sediments. And at Tubbs Inlet, flood tides, waves, and longshore flows bring sediment into the Sunset Beach system. At the Tubbs flood tide delta, waves are refracted and go into the system around the delta, and they move inlandward. And the system in Sunset Beach and Ocean Isle Beach, the marshes are dominated by Spartina vegetation. It's a very hardy marsh vegetation. And Tubbs drains about 2.5 square miles of the marsh area. Now, sedimentary deposits of Sunset Beach actually go back to the Pleistocene epoch, which is 2.5 million years ago to 11.7 thousand years ago. And the Holocene, which is 11.7 thousand years ago up to the present. So the systems have been around for quite a while in terms of this part of the coastline. The tidal range, as Spencer said, is about 4.5 to 5 feet. The mean wind speeds along the coast of Sunset Beach and Tubbs Inlet and Ocean Isle Beach are about 10 to 15 miles per hour. Those are monthly means, actually. And the mean waves at Tubbs are about 2 to 3 feet in amplitude. Now, the history of movement, as Spencer described, was basically westward prior to its relocation in 6970 via Man and Gore's dredge and fill program. So next. Now, barrier islands can be significantly altered by storm-dominated processes. And as I said earlier, they can act as a buffer or a dam to the mainland. They do protect the mainland. And this is true in the Gulf of Mexico as well as the East Coast United States. Now, because of sea level rise, there is generally a continued receding of the beachfront shoreline. As the sea level continue to rise, it inundates the coast. Now, storm overwash in the areas where there has been a great deal of buildings, such as Sunset Beach and Ocean Isle Beach and along the entire south-facing North Carolina coast, as well as the southeast-facing, we're up on in Onslow Bay, overwash is inhibited because of the buildings. And so they impede the process of getting sediments onto the backside of these islands because of the buildings. In any case, obviously, sediments do get back there. Next. So this is kind of a cartoon of how the system works. In general, in the upper left-hand corner, you see there's an 1860 shoreline, and then there was a storm, there's a cut through, and then the system reestablished itself. There's a delta that's formed, and the purge so as I said, as the waters from the storm exit, they can form an inlet or actually widen an inlet, and then the whole process starts over. You get overwash and you get flow through the inlet behind the islands, and then you actually have significant plant growth behind those islands. So next. Now, as far as sea level rise is concerned, there are some folks who doubt that sea level's been rising, but those of us who live and have studied the coastal systems of the United States as well as other parts of the world know that since the late 1800s, sea level has been rising significantly, and in fact it's rising at an increasing rate globally. So here are different trends of sea level rise from the South China Sea to Delfzig, Holland, Seattle, San Francisco, and our own coast, including Charleston, etc. So there has been a significant sea level rise, and in fact, there are a couple of hot spots now on the East Coast, one of which is, say, around Virginia Beach in Norfolk, Virginia. And it doesn't seem like, changing sea level by 3 millimeters or 4 millimeters or even a centimeter a year is a big deal, but it is because the North Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean have been rising. They've been absorbing heat from the sun and storing that heat. And so there's been a steric rise. As you heat water, it will expand. So you're getting sea level, you're getting the steric rise, which is seasonal, but the seasonality has been going up. So what sea level used to be in, say, the two warmest months of the year, September and October for the North Atlantic, as well as the North Pacific, what those 2 months were like, say, 30 years ago, is now what our winter month level of the North Atlantic and the North Pacific Ocean is. So it's been a significant rise overall. So you dump that on top of the overall sea level rise, and it starts to become more meaningful. Next slide, please. Now, Oak, Holden, Ocean Isle Beach, Sunset Beach Islands had a sand source from Frying Pan Shoals when the major flow of the Cape Fear River was actually east of the present-day Cape Fear River. The Army Corps of Engineers built a dam at Zeke's Island in the 1800s, forced the dominant flow to the west of Bald Head Island. And so the sand source that used to come from Frying Pan Shoals, which is a significant body of sand, was cut off by digging and continuing to deepen the shipping channel in the 20th century for the Wilmington port. So there's not a lot of sand coming out of the Cape Fear anymore down towards, as the Cape Fear exits and enters the Atlantic Ocean, it actually turns to its right and runs along the coast, but it's not carrying the kind of quantities of sand that it used to. So much of our sand is now coming still from littoral drift, both from the east to west, but also west to east, and by wave action, and some from offshore as well. And actually, we seem to be in an area where there's more equilibrium in terms of loss of sand and gain of sand than not. So our beaches, believe it or not, in spite of the fact that we think they're moving rapidly in some cases, they tend to be fairly stable relative to what could be the case farther south and farther north and east. Next. Now, this is a comparison of numerical model output that Moffitt and Nichols did on flows through Jinks Creek, and the numerical model output is the red line versus the diamonds, which are actual observations that were made. The difference between there's nothing wrong with the model, the numerical model that was used by Moffitt and Nichols. It used the astronomical tides as a forcing function. So that's, and it produced about 3,000 cubic feet per second. And the difference, for example, if you look at the diamond in the upper left part of that photo that's shown, taken from the report, it's 2,000 cubic feet per second different from the red line, and that's the effect of the wind. So you always have, as I said earlier, winds along the coast here about 10 miles per hour. They can move in either direction. So you will get differences in between it's the tidal forcing plus the wind forcing that adds water or pulls it out of the system. So next. Yeah, so let me see. Yep, next. I just said what that. This is just showing month by month the average winds at a National Weather Service station, and Bob Weisberg and I did a study that shows the Weather Service stations are about 10 to 20 miles inland, and as you move out of the coastal boundary layer towards the beach itself, you actually get higher winds. They're about 20% higher. So next. Now, this is a plot of, it's a little confusing, but the top line, or the top panel shown, actually is the number of winter storms, the number of extratropical cyclones that occur off of this coast per year. And they range from 3 to 13 per year. We call them nor'easters. And this was over the period 1950 to 2006. And the reason I selected that period for storms was because Stan Riggs and some students, Stan is a professor, retired professor at ECU, colleague of Spencer's and mine, and he had students measuring a distance of a fixed point from the coastline over that period of time, and a whole series of students were obviously involved in this study. In any case, what we found is that there's the coast moves. You erode the coast, and you can actually add sand to the coast. Principally, over that period of time, there's been a net erosion of the North Carolina coast. And then what I found in looking at the frequency of occurrence of storms, winter storms now, is that they have a 2 to 3 year, 5 to 7 year, 14 to 15 year, and a 30 to 35 year variability. So, you know, there's no way, as someone asked Spencer, can you predict what Tubbs Inlet is going to do in the future? If Tubbs Inlet moves as a function of winter storms and or of tropical cyclones, that's not an easy thing to predict, because the variability in the frequency of occurrence of storms is quite variable. So the variability is variable. So some years you'll get 3, some years you'll get 7, some years you'll get 13, and then the question is, how does, you know, not how the storms form, but how do they move once they formed along the coast? That's true of both winter storms, and when I say winter storms, I'm talking about extratropical cyclones that form between the months of September and April. So they cover the late fall, then the winter, and the early spring, and then we flip to a summer-fall period when we get tropical cyclones. And obviously, they fall between, well, you know, June 1st to November 30th, but actually on the North Carolina coast, we're looking principally at mid-August, late August through September, and then into October. So next, this is an example of Matthew. This is actually a real-time weather research forecast model system, and you're looking at you know, Matthew, these hurricanes rotate counterclockwise, just as do extratropical cyclones. They rotate counterclockwise as well. And the key thing about these storms is if they move along the coast or towards our coast, the winds on the top of the storm move from right to left. Okay, right to left. So the coast is actually to the right of the direction of the wind. The wind is moving along the coast and down the coast. And what that does is that drives waves and currents along and down the coast, but towards the coast also. As you get into shallower water, the net flux of the water is right at the coast, so right at the inlets. Next. And this is an example of the wave field being driven towards the North Carolina coast during Hurricane Isabel. The vertical axis is actually in meters. So those waves are 60 feet high, and they break on our beaches. And they break into the inlets, and they cause overwash. So these are not insignificant physical phenomenon. They have a great deal of energy. And so it's, my point here is that you're dealing with a very, very dynamic system, as Spencer said. Next. I won't dwell too long on this, but because Spencer did a great job of running through time history. But to the left are some USGS manifestations, characterizations of Tubbs Inlet, going back to the 1800s up through 1970 when it was stabilized. So you can see on the right, those are actual photographs of Tubbs Inlet going back to 1938. And not only that, but you can see Jinks Creek in the upper panel, which is 1938, very clearly, and obviously it's in all of those that follow. Next. I looked at the periods of time when Tubbs Inlet was the widest in that sequence of USGS images and photographs of Tubbs Inlet. The distance from the west end of Ocean Isle Beach and the east end of Sunset Beach. And in every case, I was able to find a series, or a set or a series of tropical cyclones, hurricanes that had preceded that widening. So it looks to be that one of the effects of hurricanes is to widen the inlet, and but then the system apparently corrects itself and goes back into kind of an equilibrium. It settles down again into an equilibrium state. Next. And then there was a 54-56 widening that was quite significant, and it turns out that during that period of time, beginning in August of 54 up through August of 56, there were a whole series of hurricanes that struck South Carolina and North Carolina coast in the vicinity, right in our vicinity. So next. And I won't run through these because Spencer did such a great job. So we can, but if you can actually see in I think that's 1859 in the upper right corner. I can't see it that clearly. Yes. Yeah, okay. You can see where Tubbs Inlet was in 1859. It was in the upper right. And then Spencer went through the whole sequence. So we can run through these because you can see the widening with the storms, and yeah, and actually you can see the double. You described that there were two inlets for a while, and so we can run through these then. Keep clicking. Yeah. And then what I did was I took 1993 and just outlined it in blue, and then went through 1993 up to the present. So you can see it moving back and forth somewhat, but it's been from 93 up through the present. It's actually maintained kind of a stable configuration. You can keep going, please. Yeah. Yeah. And then let's see, where are we? Have we reached Matthew yet? Not yet. Not yet. Yeah. I think we're about there's Matthew. Okay. So Matthew created this this massive delta, this big spit out there, and you can still see the 93 blue lines. The west end of Ocean Isle Beach on the upper right, on the right, center right, and then the west or the east end of Sunset, and then one more, and then there was kind of a breakthrough, which I think you showed as well, Spencer, and then one more. Yeah, looked like it was more. Yeah, so it's reestablishing itself, and it's taken a rather circuitous route. It's rather tortuous. One more. And this is, and you showed this as well, Spencer. This is post-Florence, so we use the same image. You can see that it's reestablished itself to measurable degree. All right, next. So, you know, if you increase Jinks Creek in width and depth, the flood tide delta and the creeks that feed it will receive, presumably, more water, but the system, I would think, could equilibrate from a pipe channel flow perspective. If you put more water into a system, that means more water has to leave the system. So you create hydraulic heads. So you do create pressures on the outlet. Now, The inlet throat configuration that presently exists is presumably in equilibrium with the flow. But if you increase the efficiency of the capacity of the system by dredging it, it could possibly pose a threat to the internal distribution of water within the system, because the system is going to have to adjust its piping to accommodate more water being in the system. But then again, there is that regulator, which is that big plug of sand that's at the mouth, Tubbs Inlet. So that kind of regulates how much water can get into the system. However, if a storm occurs and puts water into the backside of the system, then that water that goes into the backside has to go out, because the system can't accommodate the additional water. So the question is, where is that water going to go? So as I say in the bottom line, it's more likely that the integrity of the flood tide delta will be modified or could be compromised during a storm or a series of storms, a storm season, or over a year to two time period. Next. Now, I was looking back at some of the records, and I found that in 1993 in Folly Beach, South Carolina, the Folly River was dredged to the north or the west of the Stona Inlet, and the response to that increase in they at the time they called it an increase in efficiency in the inlet system. It actually resulted, after the next several storms, to the loss of Folly Park, which is on the south side of that inlet. So the channels within the system adjusted, and it had similar configuration to Sunset Beach and to Tubbs Inlet. So, you know, there is one example to the south of us where they decided we were going to increase the efficiency of flow within the system by dredging. And in the process of doing that, several storms showed up and actually blew out part of the property, and it was and there was a pelican habitat, et cetera, but there was a park on the south side. Next. So my conclusions are, you know, inlets move with a 1 to 2, 3 to 5, 5 to 7, 15, 30-year cycles. They're related to storms because the storms bring in the energy. They have the mechanical energy to move the waves and currents around, and that will readjust the inlet, because the inlets actually, I believe, generally speaking, form as outlets. If you have a river, you have a natural outlet from the river, so they call river mouths inlets as well as outlets. But where you don't have a river, then and you do have an inlet like Tubbs. Some of these, especially along the eastern North Carolina coast, all the way up to up through the Barrier Islands, many of those systems formed as outlets. So I would say, I'm speculating, but it looks like, given the configuration of South Jinks Creek presently, that there will probably be, and the most recent photograph of Florence, post-Florence, that there'll probably be continued erosion at the west end of Ocean Isle Beach. There could be a flip to erosion at the east end of Sunset Beach if the right set or series of storms came along in the right or wrong series of storms came along in the wrong trajectory. So putting more water and energy into the channels, the channel systems, is dicey from my perspectives. Next. So inlets are very unstable. In fact, I have long agreed with a number of colleagues, Orrin Pilkey at Duke and Stan Riggs at ECU, and other colleagues as well, that there should be a moratorium on building houses at the inlets. They can move very rapidly. over very short periods of time, as Spencer described, over the period of one or several storms or a storm season. And the water that comes in during a storm has to get back out. And pressure gradient forces of that, of those hydraulic systems will take the easiest way out. And Andy Coburn of Western Carolina University, who's a resource economist, said, what I can say with confidence is that the property value argument does nothing to support dredging. It does, however, provide a lot of evidence regarding who should pay if dredging does happen. He said the owners who want the dredging should pay the costs and the repeated costs. Now, Andy, of course, lives up in the mountains at Western Carolina University. So, but he's a resource economist, and he is part of the program that deals with coastal beaches. Next. So, facts and forecasts. You know, Matthew deposited massive amounts of sand, and they settled in a delta. The Matthew Delta was beginning to breach. Then along came Florence. It looks like it's reestablishing itself. I don't know what the annual costs of maintaining a dredged channel in an area like this would be, and who would pay for those costs. Those are always important questions because they affect everybody's pocketbook, those of you who live at Sunset Beach. Next. And so this is just, my thank you for inviting me, and then also showing that the bears here have created a Darwinian bear trap. So you take it for what it's worth. So thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Widening or dredging James Creek might be a dicey proposition. Would the opposite be true of narrowing?
I wouldn't advise narrowing it because it's a natural creek, and the principal nursery areas apparently have functioned very well over the years. As I said, these systems are, you have occasional bursts of energy that rearrange pieces of the system, but then the systems go into equilibrium. And the plants and the animals apparently, alter, the habitats get changed somewhat, but they are able to adjust to that. So either widening or narrowing Jinks Creek could alter the disposition of those animals. But I'm the wrong person to be answering the question, because I would be more, from my perspective, you really need to be concerned about the habitats and the fish that occupy those areas. They're rich. Obviously we have a rich wildlife community and turtles and oyster beds and the like, and altering that, I think is what's really dicey. So from my, offhand, if it were deepened and narrowed or widened, it might improve water quality. I don't know that. I don't know what the implications of those kinds of alterations are. But the system, as from friends of mine who fish out there and have been fishing out there for 30 years. I have friends who've lived here for now 3 decades or more. They claim that it's a very rich area, and they thoroughly enjoy what they have available. They go where things are, and then they catch them and enjoy them. So yeah. Yes, sir. I seriously doubt that because of all the pollutants that are coming down the system. You know, we've noticed that even when we shower, that some of the hardware in our showers has gotten discolored. So my wife just walked in, and she is a stickler for keeping things neat and shiny, and she's been using a lot of Windex. So the short answer is no. I would not drink water because we know that we have hog farms and chicken farms, poultry farms, etc., upstream of us. We know that there was coal ash released. I understand that that Duke Power said, "Oh yeah, we tested it. There's no problem." They took samples at the surface. Well, any geochemist worth her or his salt knows that's not where you sample for coal ash. You sample in the sediments. There have to be heavy metals that are coming down. So in any case, this, you know, I'd be very careful. In fact, I'll be honest, if we have grandchildren that love to visit us, if they were here, I think we would advise them to go swim in the pools, not the coast, not the ocean at this point. Yes, sir. I don't know, Spencer, who?
There's a state agency that does water sampling, and they've opened the entire state, to the best of my knowledge, on the ocean front.
But right now, he's just saying, it's not safe to go in the water, the stuff is still coming down. Well, you go out to the beach, you see brown water hole, and it's supposed to be clear waves, and what used to be brown, and it all turned black.
It's black.
Wash that stuff out of you. It's sitting in the sediment, as far as I know. Now, if that's sitting in the sediment, you're catching a fish that's feeding out of
Mm.
oil creeks from the sediment, you're eating it.
Don't confuse brown with pollution. Yeah.
Brown is the normal one down here. I don't think anybody's clean water.
The brown water is indicating tannic acid and an awful lot of pine straw and other things that turn it brown. You know, it's got the potential to carry other bad things with it. But what most of the studies I've seen have shown is that this was another big flush. That moderate storms pick up a whole lot of pollutants and they don't go very far. With the Floyds and the Florences, there's so much water coming down and everything is getting flushed out a lot quicker. So it's actually an advantage for the pressure that time. And the ocean is such a big mixer that it cleans up a whole lot faster than the estuaries will. So my comments are directly to the ocean front, not necessarily to the estuary. Clean water.
With the water came over the top of the mud, high up and down, along the sea. That stuff is still sitting there. That smell, maybe.
Well, it just depends on what the stuff was.
What was the palm and everything else that washed down? I mean,
It's coming downstream. There's some potential to that. Again, 30 inches of rain, how much is diluted as it goes on? I mean, it's gonna be a local question. The ocean is an easy call, but the estuaries and any ditch you've got nearby is
In areas where there's a lot of agricultural land, about 97% of the precipitation actually is absorbed by the ground, but it makes its way into the water table, and it reappears 1 to several weeks later in the rivers, and whatever it's carrying is filtered to some degree, I'm sure, as it passes through soil and rocks, but it also gets carried downstream. So it's not just what runs off, it's also what makes its way into the water systems, the watersheds, several weeks later. And those are the pulses of water that keep coming. Yes, sir. Actually, I think we're doing a lot of that in the United States. I think we're eating probably 80 or 90% of our fish are from farms. However, the recreational and commercial industry are still, you know, as far as I can tell, they're still catching wild stock. Now, there are also estuarine systems around the country where they're farming. And in fact, we have some, Sea Grant actually supports some of that development in North Carolina. Yeah. Yes?
Dan George, who is a big fisherman, who told me when I
Yes.
I would like to make a comment to this gentleman and anybody else interested, and then ask a question, okay?
Sure.
I once edited for several months a website called From the Mountains to the Sea. You can probably still find that website. The basis of it was that water flowed from the mountains to the sea. And this time, because I was evacuated and went past Charlotte, and then had difficulty returning to the coast, I became acutely aware of the fact that rivers go in both directions. You know, I had just always pictured them all running from the mountain to the sea. And here are all these rivers in the center of North Carolina, or whatever is above it, running down, and now they've flooded towns like, I don't know how to pronounce it, Socosty, South Carolina, Laurinburg, Lumberton, Fayetteville. I mean, these houses are up to their eaves in water. And they're all complaining, saying, oh, we wish we could have afforded flood insurance, but it was so expensive. Well, I live right next, I mean, a half a mile from the Calabash River, and my flood insurance was $450, is. So I don't, maybe if you live near a river, your flood insurance is $1,600 or something, I don't know. But anyway, I just wanted to add that, you know, we've all been talking about pollutants, or you all were talking about pollutants going toward the ocean, whether or not the water is safe for the fish to be eaten and the people to be in the water. It also goes in other directions and hurts a lot of other people.
Right.
But the question I have is about Tubbs Inlet. I've been here almost 24 years, and in the beginning, nobody could cross it. Then eventually it got to the point, maybe 10 years ago, where some people could swim across. Well, they needed something like a boogie board. Then they got to be able to swim without any help. Then they got to walk across, and there were lots of people walking across all the time. So my impression is, and it's been closed to boat traffic for, I would say, 8 to 10 years. No boats. And that's why the whole thing, a long time ago, where they relocated the inlet, is supposed to have happened. It was supposed to have, the story I heard, was that the fishermen from Holden and Ocean Isle, the commercial fishermen, and also the people that take people out on tours, I can't think of what their names is right now. But they were complaining because they had to go to the Little River Inlet and use all that extra fuel and time instead of going through Tubbs to get to the ocean. Well, so it was relocated and it changed locations and so on. But now it's just been closed, and it must be shallow, even though some, I think maybe both of you said it's wider. So is it any possibility of a deepening?
Sure. Yeah, there is. And as I said earlier, it's a function of the frequency of occurrence of storms, both in the winter, the fall, the summer, and the spring. We have a timetable for storms, atmospheric storms, that is almost annual. And some of the extratropical cyclone periods overlap with the tropical cyclone periods. So there's a chance it could widen and deepen. Generally, the tidal prism maintains the width and the depth of these systems, but not always. So the systems do have to equilibrate, and there's a lot of plumbing in these systems. These are very complicated systems. So the plumbing is very complicated. And by the way, the reason that the rivers run backwards is that these storms, which are rotating counterclockwise, so that the winds blow from right to left often, with the most destructive storms, block the mouths of the rivers. They bring water towards the mouth, and then they block the mouths of the rivers. Okay? If you block the mouth of a river or an estuary or a harbor, that's the widest and deepest part of that water body. If you block it, that is communicated all the way to the head of the river. The whole system starts backing up. It goes into a storage mode, okay? And the system can't relieve itself until the mouth decides to drop. And in many cases, the mouth starts dropping as the storm is leaving, because on the backside of these counterclockwise rotating storms, the winds will actually be blowing offshore. They blow the water away from the mouth. Okay? So then the system goes into a rapid discharge mode. And, you know, cars get washed off the highway and all. So those are the dangers that were not fully appreciated, how far you can communicate what's happening at the mouth. That can be communicated to the head. The water knows it's running backwards. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Environmental consequences would be, if there's a sandbar reportedly in South James Creek, a sand plot,
Yeah.
what would be the consequences if that sand plot were either disturbed or removed?
Well, Jinks Creek would flow directly out through Tubbs Inlet into the coastal ocean if that sand plug were removed.
Would that increase flooding in that area with
I think so.
coming in?
I think so. Yeah, because there's a you have it's literally clogged at the throat right now, and that's a regulator. Look. I'm sorry? That's right. Yeah. 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 There obviously is there's actually a regulator. That sandbar is a regulator.
So what happens when the plumbing gets clogged up? Which is what happens.
Yeah, it backs the system up. Yeah. Yeah. Spencer.
Well, several things can happen. One of the things that Bill has been focusing on is just James Creek. James Creek is not the only place changing. There are at least 2 or 3 other major flows into Tubbs Inlet that have changed over the years. The dredge canal behind Ocean Isle was at one time a major flow. It's been closed off almost completely at the end of the island. There's a secondary channel in there, and there's another one that's closer to a straight line. And one of the things that will change is if one channel gets clogged up, some of the flow will scour the other.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking James Creek, it's not just James Creek that's circulating Tubbs Inlet.
So we can hope that James Creek clogs up so we can have
Hey, wait a minute. Marilyn, you don't agree with that, do you? Yeah. No. He's in the flooded part of the state.
I want to make sure you all understand one thing very clearly, and unless you were camped out on Sunset Beach in Hazel, you have not seen a big storm.
Right.
And, I mean, the hurricanes of the 90s were scooting up the Cape Fear River Edwards. Lloyd snuck over far enough to beat up Oak Island, but the southern end of the county has not seen a major storm since Hurricane Hazel. There were 350 houses on Oak Island prior to Hurricane Hazel. There were 5 after. Now, you change the way you build a lot, but regardless of inlet changes, the southern end of the county hasn't seen a big storm in quite a while. So be
But-
prepared. Bad things can happen.
But
to say that storms have a bigger impact.
Well, there's difference. If you want to find an erosion problem, just drive to an inlet. You want to buy an inlet, erosion problem, go buy an inlet. So sooner or later it's gonna cause trouble, because it's oscillating, it's migrating, and it's got 5 times the erosion rate, so bad things are gonna happen. But the bigger storms, they beat up everybody.
And as I said earlier, these systems like to go into equilibrium. So, you know, they're just functioning. And there's a lot of plumbing in the system. So there are a lot of degrees of freedom for water to move in and out of those systems. And they will accommodate whatever they have to, left on their own. Unfortunately, that doesn't always suit our desires or needs. And storms, Spencer and I may not agree with this, but storms have enormous amount of energy, and they can move things around over a several-day period to a week-long period. So they're nothing to ignore, and we have them here. And actually, this is a pretty nice environment, storm-wise. I mean, because if you go to Hatteras, which is part of our state, there are a lot more storms annually there, and they're higher energy storms on average. But we've had some significant experiences in the recent past. Joaquin, Matthew, you know, Florence, et cetera. So, yes, sir.
I don't want to disagree with that at all. They have a significant major impact on the coastline, but as you saw from all of those pictures up there, man can have a significant impact on that too. What Man and Gore did when he relocated the channel for Tubbs Inlet had a more significant impact on that inlet than any storm has had in the last 75 years. All photographs that we've seen. So it's not just storms that can impact that.
Well, that's a good point.
It would be interesting to see what would have happened if it had just been moved without the dredging of Jinx Creek. Because I suspect that dredging of Jinx Creek had more of an impact than the actual relocation. Well, I think that was a major issue in reversing the migration rate, was the dredging, not just the relocation. The relocation helped, but the rapidly migrating inlets tend to be relatively small inlets,
Mhm.
low flow, and where the longshore transport rate is the same direction as the ebb tide direction. Here, that's kind of a crapshoot from year to year, but all of that makes me think that the dredging probably had more impact in reversing the flow.
I,
A man-made endeavor.
Yeah, I agree with Spencer about that, because if I look through the sequence of photographs that we have, along with studies that were done by, for example, a master's degree student at NC State, Bob Masterson, in the immediately following Man and Gore's work, he produced those USGS plots. You know, Tubbs Inlet actually several times was in that location where Man and Gore focused on. So it obviously was able to move back and forth, but it was several times it was actually there. So it may be that the Jinx Creek dredging actually was, you know, was the culprit. It could be.
It's not just storms.
Oh, yeah.
Man-made dredging or man-imposed movement of these channels.
Hmm.
And nature's gonna take its course regardless of where we leave this channel.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah, it doesn't care. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Lisa, what could you tell us about the refreshments?
They're ready.
And they are